A document with more than 40 questions. That is what shipping companies suddenly found themselves handed in the spring of 2026, before their vessels were allowed anywhere near the Strait of Hormuz. Name of the ship, identification number, any previous name it had sailed under, country of origin, country of destination. This was not a customs form from a port authority. It was issued by something calling itself the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, a body Iran had just invented, and buried inside that questionnaire was a warning so blunt that maritime risk analysts quoted it word for word to CNN. Foreigners who come from thousands of kilometers away, acting out of greed, have no place there except at the bottom of its waters. That is where this story begins. Not with a single missile, not with a single ship, but with Iran trying to turn one of the most important stretches of water on the planet into something it alone controlled. And what followed was one of the largest sustained American military operations of the decade. To understand why a 40-question shipping form could trigger months of airstrikes, you have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is. It is a narrow channel between Iran and Oman, in places only about 33 kilometers wide, with the actual shipping lanes far narrower than that. According to the Congressional Research Service, roughly 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade and close to 20% of global liquefied natural gas passes through it. There is no realistic detour. Tankers either go through the Strait of Hormuz or they do not move at all. That single geographic fact is why, for decades, American administrations of both parties have treated freedom of navigation through the strait as something close to a red line. It is also exactly why Iran chose it as the pressure point the moment war broke out. None of this was unfamiliar territory for the United States Navy, and that history matters, because it shaped how quickly Washington was willing to respond in 2026. Nearly 40 years earlier, during the final stretch of the Iran-Iraq War, the Persian Gulf went through what came to be known as the Tanker War, a years-long campaign in which both Iran and Iraq attacked merchant shipping to strangle each other's oil exports. The United States, under Operation Earnest Will, began escorting reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through the Gulf to keep oil flowing. On April 14, 1988, the American frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts struck an Iranian naval mine, a variant of an old Soviet design manufactured in North Korea, and nearly sank. According to detailed military histories of the incident, including coverage from the National Interest and the Naval History and Heritage Command, the explosion tore a hole in the frigate's hull and injured 10 sailors, though the crew managed to save the ship. 4 days later, the United States launched Operation Praying Mantis, a one-day operation that remains, according to the Naval History and Heritage Command, the largest single American surface naval action since the Second World War. 9U. Hess warships and an aircraft carrier air wing struck Iranian oil platforms used to coordinate attacks on shipping. And when Iran's navy sortied to respond, American forces sank an Iranian frigate, sank a gunboat, damaged a second frigate, and destroyed several armed speedboats at a cost of 2 American lives and 1 helicopter lost. Iran's own accounting put its losses at 56 sailors killed. The lesson Gulf military planners drew from that day, and one cited explicitly in CNN's own historical retrospective, published as this year's war unfolded, is that in the Strait of Hormuz, cheap weapons like naval mines can trigger fast, overwhelming, and highly asymmetric American retaliation. That history is precisely why, when Iran began laying mines and threatening tankers again in 2026, few naval analysts were surprised at how quickly Washington escalated to bunker-buster strikes and a full blockade. The playbook had, in broad strokes, already been written once before. The war itself did not start over Hormuz. It started on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel carried out coordinated airstrikes on Iranian military and government targets. Among those killed, according to multiple wire service reports, was Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with a number of senior Iranian officials. That single event reordered the entire regional balance of power overnight, and it is the reason everything that follows has to be read as retaliation, not as an isolated Iranian decision. Tehran's response was not to strike back only inside its own borders or against Israel directly. It reached for the one lever it has always known it holds, the Strait of Hormuz. Within days, Iranian forces began doing 3 things simultaneously. Ships were warned to use only pre-approved routes set by Iranian authorities. Iranian vessels began boarding and, in some cases, attacking merchant ships judged to be non-compliant. And, according to multiple outlets including the BBC and Reuters, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps began laying naval mines across sections of the strait. By mid-March, marine traffic data cited by CNN showed almost no tanker or freight traffic moving through the waterway at all. A route that under normal conditions carries somewhere between 115 and 130 ships a day had gone effectively silent. Then came the demand for money. Iranian lawmaker Alaeddin Boroujerdi told state broadcaster IRIL, in comments picked up by Iran International and later reported by Fox News, that some tankers were being charged as much as $2 million simply to be allowed through. Boroujerdi did not frame this as extortion. He framed it as strength. Collecting $2 million in transit fees from vessels crossing the strait, he said, reflects Iran's power. Not long after, an advisor to Iran's supreme leadership, Mohammad Mokhber, told the Mehr news agency that a, quote, new regime for the Strait of Hormuz would follow the war, one that would let Tehran restrict the passage of any nation that had sanctioned it. Iran's parliament, according to the Iranian Students' News Agency, began drafting an actual bill to formalize toll collection on every country, using the strait for shipping, energy, or food supplies. This is the moment the title of this story refers to. Iran's leadership was not simply defending itself. It was attempting, in the words of its own officials, to establish permanent unilateral control over one of the most strategically vital waterways on Earth, and to charge the rest of the world for the privilege of using it. Legal scholars quoted by NBC News, including maritime law expert James Kraska, pointed out that Iran cannot lawfully impose unilateral route changes or fees under the Convention on the International Maritime Organization or the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea. Iran, in other words, was asserting a right that international law does not recognize it as having. That did not stop it from acting as though it already had that right. Washington's answer did not take long to arrive, and it did not come from diplomats first. It came from CENTCOM. On March 17, 2026, United States Central Command announced it had employed multiple GBU-72 munitions, 5,000-pound bunker-penetrating bombs, against underground missile silos along the Iranian coastline near the strait. These were not symbolic strikes. The GBU-72 is designed to punch through layers of rock and reinforced concrete, specifically to destroy hardened bunkers. And CENTCOM said the targets were storage sites for Iran's cruise missiles and unused anti-ship missiles, the exact weapon systems Iran would need to threaten tankers and warships moving through the strait. 2 days later, on March 19th, the United States formally began what has since been documented as the 2026 Strait of Hormuz campaign, an aerial operation involving the United States Air Force, the United States Navy, and the Israeli Air Force, all directed at reopening the waterway by force. President Trump's public language matched the scale of the operation. In late March and early April, he repeatedly issued direct ultimatums to Tehran, threatening, according to reporting cited in Wikipedia's documentation of the naval blockade and corroborated by contemporaneous news coverage, to destroy Iran's infrastructure and, in his words, bomb it back to the Stone Ages if the Strait of Hormuz was not reopened. Iran's Revolutionary Guards answered defiantly, stating that the strait, quote, will not be open to the enemies of this nation through the ridiculous spectacle by the President of the United States. Trump, for his part, claimed that 158 vessels belonging to Iran's naval forces had been destroyed by that point in the campaign, leaving Tehran, in his telling, with only small, high-speed attack boats still operational. That figure came directly from the American president and has not been independently verified vessel by vessel by a neutral body, so it should be treated as a claim rather than a confirmed count, even as it captures how aggressively the campaign was being framed in Washington. By early April, talks in Islamabad, Pakistan, aimed at de-escalating the crisis, had collapsed. On April 13th, President Trump ordered something considerably larger than airstrikes, a full naval blockade of Iranian ports, covering, according to CENTCOM's own description, the entirety of the Iranian coastline. Any vessel entering or leaving that zone without American authorization was warned it would be treated as hostile. This was not a blockade in name only. Through mid-June, CENTCOM reported having redirected more than 140 ships and disabled 9 that attempted to defy it. The Congressional Research Service later estimated the blockade was costing Iran roughly $500 million a day. Iran responded in kind by seizing 2 cargo ships of its own, a tit-for-tat exchange that underscored just how far both sides were willing to go over control of this single stretch of water. On May 3rd, the Trump administration unveiled a different kind of response, one built around protecting shipping rather than punishing Iran directly. It was called Project Freedom, and its purpose was to help commercial mariners navigate a southern route through the strait, hugging the coast of Oman, deliberately avoiding Iranian territorial waters where Tehran's forces had been asserting jurisdiction. Maritime risk consultant Demetrius Maniatis, speaking to CNN, described how under Iran's own preferred routing, ships were being funneled through a corridor. Close to the Iranian coast between the islands of Keshem and Larak, precisely the kind of narrow, controllable passage that would let Tehran monitor and tax every vessel that passed. The American Southern Corridor was a direct rejection of that arrangement. For a few days in early May, it looked like the pressure might be working. But the pause that followed was not simply a diplomatic breakthrough. According to the Congressional Research Service's own timeline, 2 days after Project Freedom launched, Iran carried out attacks against the United Arab Emirates and Oman, and Saudi Arabia reportedly objected to the United States using its airspace for the operation. Trump himself said at the time that Project Freedom was being paused at the request of Pakistan and other countries, a far messier picture than a simple ceasefire breakthrough. Still, by May 6th, President Trump announced the pause publicly in more optimistic terms, saying there had been, in his words, great progress toward what he called a complete and final agreement with Iran. Around the same period, the International Maritime Organization worked with Oman to organize what was described as an evacuation of mariners who had been trapped in the Gulf for weeks, routing them through Omani waters well south of both Iran's territorial waters and the traditional Hormuz shipping lanes, a sign of just how unsafe the direct route through the strait had become even for humanitarian purposes. That agreement did eventually take shape, on paper at least. On June 17, 2026, the United States and Iran signed a memorandum of understanding. Iran agreed to what the deal described as making arrangements, using its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial vessels through the strait, and, critically, agreed to waive transit fees for a 60-day window. NPR's Middle East correspondents discussing the deal on air flagged the obvious problem immediately. The 60-day language was a built-in expiration date, and anyone reading it closely, especially in Tehran, would understand that the moment those 60 days ended, the door to charging tolls again would swing back open. That is almost exactly what happened. By early July, Iranian forces had resumed attacks on shipping. On July 6th and July 7th, Iran struck multiple vessels, including 3 commercial ships, actions the White House and CENTCOM characterized as a direct violation of the June memorandum. President Trump said publicly that he now considered the truce over. Within a week, on July 13th, the United States reinstated its naval blockade of Iranian ports. CENTCOM followed almost immediately with another wave of strikes, hitting what it described as dozens of Iranian military targets near the Strait of Hormuz in a 7-hour operation involving American fighter aircraft, drones, and naval vessels, targeting missile and drone sites, naval assets, and coastal defenses. More than 20 American warships and hundreds of aircraft were operating across the region at that point, according to reporting from The Hill. Iran's response to renewed CENTCOM strikes was not limited to the strait itself. The IRGC announced retaliatory strikes targeting American facilities in Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain, according to reporting tracked by the International Crisis Group. And an IRGC spokesman, Brigadier General Hossein Mohebi, publicly warned that any country supporting the American military effort, whether Britain, Persian Gulf states, or others, would become what he called a legitimate target. Iran's own Persian Gulf Strait Authority declared around the same period that the strait would remain closed until further notice, a claim CENTCOM directly disputed, insisting that commercial ships were continuing to transit in and out despite Tehran's declaration. That gap between Iranian declarations of closure and American declarations of control has been one of the defining, recurring features of this entire crisis. Analysts also flagged a secondary risk during this period. Yemen's Houthi movement, already active against shipping in the Red Sea, represented what Kapler's market analysis called a real escalation risk, since any formal entry by a Gulf Cooperation Council state into the wider war could open a second front, disrupting Saudi Arabia's primary alternative export route through the Red Sea's Bab al-Mandeb Strait, potentially removing the one major bypass Gulf producers were counting on. It was also in this period that President Trump introduced an idea almost nobody had been expecting, that the United States itself might start charging tolls to protect the strait. Asked directly whether he would accept a deal letting Iran collect fees from passing ships, Trump responded, "What about us charging tolls? I'd rather do that than let them have them. Why shouldn't we? We're the winner. We won." Days later, he went further, saying the U.S. military would protect shipping through Hormuz, but demanded reimbursement equivalent to 20% of the value of everything transiting the strait, describing the arrangement as, in his words, a beautiful thing. The reaction from the International Maritime Organization, a United Nations body, was swift and blunt. A spokesperson told CNBC that the IMO stands firmly against charging fees for passage through straits used for international navigation, and that there is no legal basis through which to introduce mandatory tolls simply to transit a strait. In other words, the same international legal framework that rejected Iran's toll claims applied just as clearly to an American toll claim. Whether Washington would actually attempt to formalize such a fee remains, as of this recording, an unresolved and contested question, not a settled fact, and it deserves to be reported that way rather than treated as something already decided. Through July and into August, the pattern repeated itself in cycles. Iranian attacks or threats against shipping, American strikes and enforcement actions in response, brief lulls, then renewed friction. According to the Congressional Research Service's own accounting, prolonged instability in the Strait of Hormuz persisted, through most of the 5 months leading into early August 2026. This is not a story with a clean, single ending. It is an ongoing standoff. The most responsible way to report it is to say plainly what is confirmed as of the most recent data and what remains disputed between the two sides. Here is where things stood as of the second week of August 2026, according to CENTCOM's own public statements and reporting from CNN and Al Jazeera. Since the blockade was reinstated on July 13th, CENTCOM reported having redirected 55 commercial vessels, disabled 3, and boarded 2 to enforce compliance. One of the most recent incidents involved a vessel called the Vela Nova, a 1996-built cargo ship, which CENTCOM said ignored repeated warnings from American forces before a U.S. Navy MH-60 helicopter fired on it, disabling its steering gear. All 17 crew members abandoned ship and were accounted for, with no reported casualties, and the resulting fire was extinguished. Neither CENTCOM nor any government publicly claimed ownership of the vessel's cargo through the most recent reporting cutoff, and the Iranian port it may have been destined for was not identified. 2 earlier vessels, the Curaçao-flagged Belma and the Mozambique-flagged Levine, were disabled in similar enforcement actions in mid and late July. On the diplomatic side, Iran has not softened. A senior Iranian official named Rezaei issued what was described as the fullest statement of Iranian conditions since early August, saying on social media that the Strait of Hormuz will remain closed until all conditions are met, listing an end to the war, an end to the blockade, the release of frozen Iranian assets, and an end to conflicts elsewhere in the region, specifically naming Lebanon and Gaza as prerequisites. He reportedly told China's ambassador in Tehran that reopening the strait depends on Washington changing its behavior first. President Trump, for his part, told reporters at Joint Base Andrews that the situation is, in his words, going fine, insisting we totally control the Strait of Hormuz, and warning that if Iran does something further, quote, they get blown away. In a separate interview aired on Real America's Voice, he described the current American approach as one of patience, waiting for Iranian economic pressure to build, saying, just bop along and look how bad they're doing while keeping open the option to hit them really, really hard. There is a gap between that confident public rhetoric and what shipping data actually shows. Kepler, a firm that tracks maritime traffic, recorded only 8 transits through the Strait of Hormuz on August 10th, 2026, compared with a pre-war daily average of roughly 115 to 130 ships. That is not a fully reopened strait. It is a waterway still functioning at a small fraction of its normal capacity, regardless of who claims control over it. Reporting from Axios, cited by multiple outlets, added another complication. Admiral Brad Cooper, the top American commander in the region, reportedly advised President Trump that continued airstrikes around the strait were losing their effectiveness, telling him that available targets had largely been exhausted and that further strikes made little sense unless the United States was prepared to return to full-scale combat operations. That advice reportedly factored into Trump's decision in early August to pause a threatened new multi-day bombing campaign, a pause that, according to operational updates tracked by defense analysts, had extended for 13 consecutive nights by August 12th. None of this has been without human and economic cost, and any honest account of this story has to include that. According to documentation of the broader Strait of Hormuz crisis, the toll since the crisis began includes 1 tugboat sunk, at least 17 merchant ships damaged, of which 7 were reportedly abandoned, 2 merchant ships captured, 12 seafarers killed or missing, and 1 port worker killed with 2 more wounded in an incident in Bahrain. Separately, an early strike on the tanker Skylight off the coast of Oman on March 1st, 2026, killed 2 people and injured 4, according to an account published by the Arab Center in Washington. Those figures come from tracking of the broader conflict and, where flagged as unverified in the underlying record, should be treated with appropriate caution rather than presented as ironclad. The economic ripple effects have been just as dramatic as the military ones. On the first Tuesday of March 2026, after Aramco halted operations at Saudi Arabia's largest refinery in Ras Tanura following a drone strike, and after falling debris from an intercepted drone triggered a fire. At the UAE's oil trading hub in Fujairah, West Texas Intermediate crude futures surged more than 8% in a single session, according to data tracked by Trading Economics, briefly touching prices not seen since early the previous year. Prices eased somewhat only after President Trump pledged naval escorts for tankers, but shipping activity through the Persian Gulf remained largely stalled as insurers began withdrawing war risk coverage for vessels entering the Gulf altogether. A market analysis compiled by reinsurance broker Howden, dated late March 2026, described the situation as the worst oil supply shock in nearly 50 years, and a rare event capable of testing marine, energy, aviation, and political risk insurance markets simultaneously. The same analysis noted Iranian strikes on the Ras-Laffan liquefied natural gas facility in Qatar, forcing Qatar Energy to halt production there, and drone strikes on Bahrain's only oil refinery. The production numbers tell their own story. According to Reuters-sourced figures analyzed by the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Saudi Arabia cut crude output from just over 10 million barrels a day in February 2026 to under 7 million by April. Iraq's production fell from 14 million barrels a day to 49 million. The UAE dropped from 39 million to 2 million, and Kuwait's output collapsed from 58 million barrels a day to just 560,000. Those are not abstract statistics. They represent a substantial share of the world's oil supply effectively taken offline because the water it needed to move through had become a war zone. Saudi Arabia and the UAE both began routing what oil they could through overland pipelines instead, the East-West pipeline to the Red Sea and the Abu Dhabi pipeline to the Gulf of Oman, precisely to avoid the strait altogether, according to the Congressional Research Service. Gulf Arab states, for their part, made clear through diplomatic channels that any arrangement granting Iran formal oversight of transit through Hormuz was, in the words of one Kapler market analysis, constitutionally unacceptable to them under international maritime law, since it was their own oil, not Iran's, that depended most heavily on the strait staying open on neutral terms. Inflation data tracked by the Associated Press in mid-August 2026 noted that prices remained elevated in part because of the ongoing Iran war and its effects on energy markets. The disruption did not stay contained to the Gulf. Wikipedia's ongoing documentation of what has been labeled the 2026 Iran war fuel crisis notes that economies most reliant on the Strait of Hormuz for energy imports are concentrated in Asia, with Europe also treating the strait as vital to its own energy security, and Britain in particular flagged as likely to be among the hardest hit major economies over the medium term. A British think tank, the Food Policy Institute, warned that the disruption to fuel and fertilizer markets could drive food prices higher well beyond the Middle East, since the Persian Gulf is also a major hub for global fertilizer production. Vietnam experienced fuel shortages and panic buying at filling stations, according to the same tracking. None of this was accidental collateral damage. It was the direct mechanical result of roughly a fifth of the world's seaborne oil and a similar share of its liquefied natural gas running through a single contested channel of water. China's position in all of this deserves particular attention because Beijing has more riding on the Strait of Hormuz than almost any other government on Earth, and it has handled that exposure in a way that shaped the whole conflict. According to research from the CSIS China Power Project, China was importing about 4 million barrels of crude oil a day through the strait as of early 2025, more than India, South Korea, and Japan combined, along with roughly 23% of the LNG that transits the waterway. When the war began, Chinese oil imports fell sharply, and Axios reported that this deliberate pullback by the world's largest crude buyer actually helped prevent the kind of extreme global price spike many analysts had originally expected. China was able to absorb the shock in part because of enormous stockpiles, estimated by the analytics firm Kairos at 39 billion barrels as of early March. Enough, according to Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy, to cover around 120 days of net imports at prior levels. At the same time, China continued quietly taking Iranian oil throughout the war. NPR reported in August that China has for years been the destination for roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports, almost entirely because Chinese buyers and refiners are willing to absorb the risk of American secondary sanctions that most other countries avoid. And that pattern continued even under blockade conditions, with import volumes around 7 million barrels a day before the war, and continued, if reduced, flows afterward. Diplomatically, Brookings noted that China tried to stay neutral, even voting against a United Nations Security Council resolution backed by Bahrain and other Gulf states meant to protect shipping through Hormuz, while also publicly condemning Iranian attacks on Gulf state sovereignty, an attempt at balance that, in Brookings' own assessment, left neither Tehran nor the Gulf states particularly satisfied with Beijing's position. So what did the United States military actually do in total once Iran's mullahs made their move to seize control of the Strait of Hormuz? It did not do one thing. It did 5, layered on top of each other over the course of nearly 6 months. It used 5,000-pound bunker-busting munitions to physically destroy the missile infrastructure Iran would have needed to enforce its claim over the strait. It launched a sustained aerial campaign involving the U.S. Air Force, U.S. Navy, and the Israeli Air Force to degrade Iran's naval and coastal capabilities. It imposed and later reimposed a full naval blockade covering the entire Iranian coastline, redirecting and disabling ships attempting to defy it. It built an alternative, American-protected southern shipping corridor through Project Freedom, effectively offering the world's shipping companies a way to bypass Iran's demands altogether. And it kept enforcing all of it, vessel by vessel, week after week, well into August 2026, even as ceasefires were signed, broken, and renegotiated. Whether any of it has produced a durable, lasting outcome is still genuinely open. The strait is not fully closed. It is also nowhere near fully open. Both governments are, as of this recording, still claiming a version of control that the actual shipping numbers do not fully support. Before closing, it's worth being transparent about where all of this comes from and where the picture is still incomplete. The timeline of strikes, the naval blockade, and Project Freedom draws on CENTCOM's own public statements, Congressional Research Service reporting prepared for lawmakers, and wire and broadcast reporting from Reuters, CNN, Al Jazeera, the BBC, Fox News, and NPR. The specific toll figures cited by Iranian officials and lawmakers come from Iranian state and semi-official outlets, including IRB, MER, and the Iranian Students' News Agency, and should be understood as Tehran's own framing of its actions, rather than independently confirmed transaction records. President Trump's claim of 158 destroyed Iranian naval vessels has not been separately verified by an outside body, and is presented here as a stated claim, not a confirmed figure. Casualty and vessel damage totals for the broader crisis come from ongoing tracking of the conflict and carry the same caveat. Some individual entries in that record are explicitly flagged as unconfirmed, and the question of whether the United States will actually impose its own transit fee, something President Trump has floated, but which the International Maritime Organization has already rejected as having no legal basis, remains unresolved. The historical account of the 1980s tanker war and Operation Praying Mantis draws on the Naval History and Heritage Command's own records, the national interest, and CNN's dedicated historical retrospective, published as the current war unfolded. The economic and energy figures cited here, including Gulf production cuts, insurance market strain, and China's import volumes, come from the Congressional Research Service, the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Kapler Market Analysis, the CSIS China Power Project, Brookings, the Bruegel Institute, Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy, and Trading Economics Real-Time Commodity Tracking, all named and checkable sources, rather than anonymous aggregation. Anything framed here as settled fact is drawn from named government statements or established wire reporting. Anything still contested between Washington and Tehran, including the ultimate legal status of any toll on the Strait of Hormuz, whether Iranian or American, has been presented as exactly that, a dispute, not a verdict. It's also worth being honest about the limits of American leverage here, because the story does not end with a clean American victory any more than it ends with a clean Iranian one. Admiral Cooper's own assessment that available strike targets have largely been exhausted points to a hard ceiling on what air power alone can accomplish against a country that has already absorbed months of bombardment and the loss of its supreme leader. Iran, for its part, has shown it can keep selling oil to China regardless of the blockade, keep drafting toll legislation regardless of international objections, and keep tying the reopening of the strait to conditions and conflicts hundreds of kilometers away that have nothing directly to do with Hormuz itself. That is not the posture of a government that considers itself defeated. What's harder to measure is what happens next. Iran has tied the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz to conditions far beyond the strait itself, including conflicts in Lebanon and Gaza that Washington does not fully control. The United States has a military commander on record suggesting that airstrikes alone are running out of road, and global shipping, caught in the middle, is still moving at a fraction of its normal volume through one of the most important choke points on the planet. Layer all of that together, and a clearer picture emerges of why this particular waterway has become the single most consequential piece of geography in this entire war. It is not simply that Iran wanted leverage. It is that Iran identified, correctly, that the Strait of Hormuz is one of the very few places on the map where a militarily weaker power can impose real, measurable costs on the rest of the world simply by making the water itself dangerous to cross. Mines are cheap. Small boats are cheap. Even bureaucratic tools like a 40-question customs form and a toll schedule are cheap. What they buy, when deployed against a choke point carrying a fifth of the world's oil and a fifth of its liquefied natural gas, is disproportionate leverage over economies thousands of kilometers away that had nothing to do with the war's opening strikes. The United States military's answer, whatever else can be said about it, has been built around denying Iran that leverage through overwhelming, repeated, and sustained force, rather than accepting any version of Iranian control, even a temporary or partial one, as a price worth paying for calm. Do you think a negotiated settlement over the Strait of Hormuz is realistic in the near term, or is this the kind of standoff that only gets resolved by one side running out of options first? Let us know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.